The photograph fell from between the yellowed pages of the hymnal like a ghost escaping from its prison. I remember the exact weight of the silence that followed, the way the dust motes hung suspended in the shaft of October light, cutting through my grandmother's attic window. The smell, that particular cocktail of cedar, mothballs, and something older, something that whispered of decades folded away and forgotten. My name is Nathan Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and until that afternoon in my grandparents' attic, I believed I understood what love looked like. The photograph showed a woman I didn't recognize, dark hair pinned in victory rolls, a white dress that wasn't a wedding gown, but carried that same breathless formality. She was standing beside a lake I'd never seen, and she was holding the hand of my grandfather. My grandfather, Walter Brennan Calloway, who had been married to my grandmother Lorraine for 60 years, whose anniversary party we were preparing for that very weekend, whose love story had been the foundation upon which 3 generations of Calloways had built their understanding of commitment, sacrifice, and devotion. But it wasn't the photograph that shattered everything. It was what was written on the back. And it was the letter, folded into quarters, tucked behind the photograph like a confession waiting for its priest, that tore apart 6 decades of carefully constructed truth. I heard my grandmother's voice floating up from the kitchen 2 floors below, the clatter of serving platters, my mother and my Aunt Cecilia laughing about something inconsequential. The ordinary sounds of a family preparing to celebrate what we all believed was the greatest love story we'd ever witnessed. My hands were trembling as I unfolded that letter. The paper was so old it felt like touching skin. Onion skin, they used to call it. The kind of paper people wrote important things on when important things still got written by hand. The ink had faded from black to sepia, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was my grandfather's, and the first line read, "My dearest Vivian, I am writing this knowing it will be the last letter I ever send you, and I need you to understand why I am choosing to stay with her instead of spending my life with you, even though you are carrying my child." The attic tilted. I grabbed the edge of the steamer trunk to steady myself, and somewhere below me my grandmother called out, "Nathan, honey, did you find those old photo albums yet? Your grandfather wants to show everyone the pictures from the cabin." I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. 60 years. 60 years of Christmas mornings watching them hold hands during grace. 60 years of anniversary dinners, where my grandfather would stand up, raise his glass, and tell the same story about how he knew Lorraine was the one from the moment he saw her at the church social in 1962. 60 years of my grandmother pressing her hand to her heart and pretending to blush like a schoolgirl. 60 years of lies. And in my hands I held proof of a woman named Vivian, a child no one had ever mentioned, and a choice my grandfather had made before I was born, a choice that meant someone, somewhere, had been living an entirely different version of this story, a version where they were the ones who had been abandoned. I folded the letter back into its quarters, slid the photograph inside, and tucked both into the inside pocket of my jacket, right against my heart, where the weight of them burned like a brand. "Coming, Grandma," I called down. I found them, but what I'd really found was the fuse that would detonate my entire family. And I had 3 days until the anniversary party to decide whether to light it. To understand the magnitude of what I discovered in that attic, you need to understand the myth of Walter and Lorraine Calloway. In our family, their love story wasn't just a story, it was scripture. My grandfather grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a steel town built on sweat, smoke, and the kind of blue-collar grit that either makes you or breaks you. His father, my great-grandfather Earl, worked the blast furnaces at Bethlehem Steel for 43 years, retired on a Friday, dead of black lung by the following Christmas. That was 1957. My grandfather was 17 years old. With Earl gone, Walter became the man of the house overnight. His mother Edna was already showing signs of the dementia that would eventually take her mind piece by piece. His younger brother Morris was only 11. So Walter did what men in Johnstown did. He quit school 3 months before graduation and walked into the same mill that had killed his father. He worked the coke ovens first, the worst job in the plant. Temperatures that could melt the fillings out of your teeth. Air so thick with coal dust and sulfur that you'd cough black phlegm into your handkerchief for hours after your shift. Men lost fingers, hands, eyes. One wrong step, and the molten river of pig iron would turn you into a memory and a pension check. But Walter never complained. That was the other part of the legend, his stoicism, his quiet dignity, his refusal to ever play the victim. He worked doubles when the plant offered them, triples when Morris needed braces. He put aside a little money every week in a coffee can he kept buried in the backyard because he didn't trust banks. And then in 1962, he walked into a church social at Holy Cross Lutheran and saw Lorraine Whitfield standing by the punch bowl in a blue dress the color of a summer sky. She was 19, the daughter of a foreman at the same mill. Pretty in that simple, wholesome way that postcards tried to capture. Modest curves, wheat-colored hair, eyes that crinkled at the corners when she laughed. She was studying to be a schoolteacher at the community college in Indiana County, and everyone said she was destined for better things than Johnstown could offer. But then she met Walter. The way my grandmother told it, she knew the moment their eyes met. It was like someone had reached inside my chest and rearranged everything, she would say every Thanksgiving, every anniversary, every wedding reception where someone asked her the secret to 60 years of marriage. I looked at that man and I just knew God had made him for me. They married 7 months later. Small ceremony. Her dress was borrowed from her cousin. His suit was the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral, let out in the shoulders because he'd grown since then. The reception was held in the church basement. Egg salad sandwiches, fruit punch. Someone's uncle played accordion. And then they began the long, slow process of building a life together. Walter kept working at the mill. Lorraine finished her teaching certificate and took a job at the elementary school on Cypress Avenue, teaching 3rd grade. They bought a small house on Oak Street, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a yard barely big enough for a vegetable garden. They had my mother, Caroline, in 1965. My Aunt Cecilia followed in 1968. And somewhere in between, Walter got promoted to shift supervisor, which meant a few more dollars and a few less hours breathing in coal dust. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy. There were lean years when Christmas meant homemade gifts and creative budgeting. There were arguments about money, about whose family they'd visit for holidays, about whether to get a dog. Normal struggles, human struggles. But through it all, according to the family gospel, Walter and Lorraine never wavered. They were the couple other couples measured themselves against. They were the proof that true love existed, that commitment meant something, that you could build something lasting in a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart. My mother grew up hearing their story like a lullaby. She internalized every lesson, that love was patient, that marriage required sacrifice, that a good man showed his devotion through constancy, not grand gestures. So when her own marriage fell apart, when my father walked out 3 weeks before my 8th birthday to move to Arizona with his secretary, she didn't have a roadmap for that. She had no template for failure. All she had was the image of her parents, still holding hands at the dinner table, still kissing each other good morning, like the war brides in old newsreels. Your grandparents give me hope, she used to tell me when I was young and confused about why Daddy wasn't coming back. Some love is the forever kind. You just have to find it. I believed her. For 34 years, I believed her. And now I was standing in my grandparents' kitchen, watching my grandmother arrange deviled eggs on a crystal platter, while my grandfather sat in his recliner in the next room, and I had a letter in my pocket that proved the entire foundation of our family was built on sand. The anniversary party was in 3 days. 247 people were expected. The American Legion Hall had been rented. A caterer had been hired. My cousin David had spent 3 weeks editing together a video montage of family photographs set to The Way We Were, and I was the only one who knew that the man we were about to celebrate had fathered a child with another woman, a woman he had loved, a woman he had chosen to leave. The question that kept circling in my head as I helped carry folding chairs to the garage and smiled at my grandmother's jokes and pretended that everything was normal was this. What happened to Vivian? And what happened to the child? That night, I couldn't sleep. I was staying in my old bedroom at my mother's house, 3 streets over from my grandparents' place. The wallpaper was the same as it had been when I was 12, faded baseball pennants, a poster of Ken Griffey Jr. that I'd never bothered to take down. But the room felt different now, smaller, like the walls were pressing in. I sat on the edge of the bed with the letter unfolded on my knees, reading it for the fourth time. The handwriting was definitely my grandfather's. I knew that penmanship as well as I knew my own. He'd written me letters every year at summer camp, letters full of advice about fishing and staying out of trouble, and remembering to write my grandmother back so she wouldn't worry. Same precise capital letters, same slight leftward slant. But the voice in this letter was someone I'd never met. "My dearest Vivian," it began. "I am writing this knowing it will be the last letter I ever send you, and I need you to understand why I am choosing to stay with her instead of spending my life with you, even though you are carrying my child. You have to believe me when I say this is the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than burying my father, harder than all those years in the mill when I thought my lungs would give out before I ever saw 40. This is a different kind of dying, Vivian. The kind where you keep breathing but something inside you goes dark forever. I love you. I have loved you since that first afternoon by the lake when you laughed at my terrible joke about the fisherman and the priest, and I thought to myself, this is what all the songs are about. This is what the poets were trying to say. I didn't know a person could feel that way about another person until I met you, but I made a promise to Lorraine, before God and her family and the whole congregation, and she doesn't deserve to be abandoned. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's a good woman, a kind woman. She would be devastated if I left, and I don't think I could live with myself knowing I had destroyed her like that. I know what you're thinking, that I'm a coward, that I'm choosing the easy path. But you have to understand there is no easy path here. Every road leads to someone's ruin. And if I have to choose whose heart to break, I have to choose mine, and yours. Because Lorraine is innocent in all of this. She didn't ask for this. She didn't deserve a husband who fell in love with someone else. I'm sending you the money I've saved. It's not much, $340 and some change, but it should be enough to help you get settled somewhere new, somewhere you can start over, somewhere the baby can grow up without the shadow of all this hanging over them. Please don't try to contact me. Please don't come to Johnstown. If Lorraine ever found out, it would kill her. And I mean that literally. Her heart is fragile, Vivian, more fragile than she lets on. The doctor has already warned her about stress. I'm asking you to disappear. I know that's a terrible thing to ask. I know I have no right, but I'm asking anyway. Raise our child well. Tell them their father loved them, even if he was too much of a coward to be there. Yours in whatever way I can still be yours, Walter. The letter was dated March 17th, 1963. That was 5 months after my grandparents' wedding, 4 months before my mother was conceived, which meant there was a child out there, a half-sibling to my mother and aunt, who would be 61 years old now. Someone who had lived an entire life not knowing, or maybe knowing all too well, that their father had chosen a different family over them. I felt sick, not just at the betrayal, but at the casual cruelty of it. I'm asking you to disappear. Like Vivian was a stain that needed to be scrubbed out. Like their child was an inconvenience to be managed with $340 and a request for silence. This wasn't the grandfather I knew. The grandfather I knew had taught me how to tie a fishing fly when I was 7. Had driven 4 hours to watch me graduate from high school because my father couldn't be bothered to fly in from Phoenix. Had sat with me on the porch after my divorce and told me in that quiet, steady voice of his that some things weren't meant to be and that didn't make them failures. That grandfather had seemed incapable of cruelty. But the man who wrote this letter, that man had abandoned a pregnant woman and asked her to vanish so his real life wouldn't be disrupted. I folded the letter again, slid it back into my jacket, and I made a decision. I was going to find out what happened to Vivian. I was going to find out what happened to the child, and then, only then, would I decide whether to burn my family's legacy to the ground. The first thing I did the next morning was call in sick to work. I'm a project manager for a construction company in Pittsburgh, about an hour's drive from Johnstown. It's stable work, good benefits. The kind of job my grandfather would have approved of. Practical, honest, building things that last. But I hadn't been able to focus on spreadsheets and subcontractor schedules since I'd unfolded that letter. My boss, a gruff man named Hendricks, who'd known my family for 20 years, didn't ask questions when I said I needed a few personal days. Family stuff, I told him, and he grunted in understanding. What I didn't tell him was that the family stuff might destroy the family. I started with the obvious, the internet. But searching for Vivian 1963 Johnstown, Pennsylvania was like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach. The name was too common, the time period was too far back, and without a last name I was chasing shadows. The photograph I'd found with the letter offered some clues. The lake in the background had a distinctive shape, narrow at one end, widening into something almost circular at the other, like a tadpole. The shoreline was rocky, dotted with birch trees. Not a Johnstown lake. The terrain was different, softer, more New England than Pennsylvania. I spent 2 hours comparing satellite images of lakes in the surrounding states before I found it. Lake Wallenpaupack. It was in the Poconos, about 3 hours east of Johnstown, a popular vacation spot, even back in the 1960s. There were resorts there, I learned, places where young couples went to escape the grime of steel towns and pretend, for a weekend, that life could be beautiful. Had my grandfather taken Vivian there, a secret getaway while his wife believed he was working overtime at the mill? I kept digging. The archives of the Johnstown Tribune-Democrat were partially digitized, but the 1962 to 1963 editions were only available on microfilm at the Cambria County Library. I made a note to visit in person. Then I tried a different approach. Ancestry.com. I had a subscription. Had gotten it years ago when my mother went through a genealogy phase and wanted help building the family tree. I logged in and started searching birth records from 1963, looking for any child born to a mother named Vivian in Pennsylvania or the surrounding states. The problem was that in 1963, birth records weren't centralized the way they are now. Each county kept its own files. Many of them had never been digitized. And if Vivian had moved away before giving birth, which seemed likely given my grandfather's instructions to disappear, she could have delivered that baby anywhere in the country. I was starting to understand why secrets from 60 years ago stayed buried, but then I caught a break. It came from an unexpected source, the back of the photograph itself. I'd read the inscription a dozen times. Wallenpaupack, August 1962, my Vivian. But I hadn't looked closely at the edges of the photo. Now holding it up to the morning light, I noticed something I'd missed before. There was a stamp, faded almost to invisibility, pressed into the bottom right corner. Kowalski Portrait Studio, Scranton, PA. Scranton was 40 miles from Lake Wallenpaupack, close enough for a day trip. Close enough that a couple might stop there on their way home from a romantic weekend at the lake. And if Kowalski Portrait Studio had been in business in 1962, there was a chance, a small chance, that they might still have records. Photographers back then often kept negatives, sometimes for decades. It was a long shot. But it was all I had. The drive to Scranton took about 2.5 hours through winding mountain roads that my GPS struggled to navigate. The fall foliage was at its peak, hillsides exploding in orange and crimson and gold, but I barely noticed. My mind was elsewhere, rehearsing questions, imagining scenarios, preparing for dead ends. Kowalski Portrait Studio no longer existed. I'd Googled it before I left and found nothing, no website, no Yelp listing, no Facebook page. But a search of the Scranton Chamber of Commerce historical records showed that a photography business by that name had operated out of an address on Lackawanna Avenue from 1948 to 1987. The building was still there. It was a florist shop now, roses, blooms and more, sandwiched between a barber shop and a vape store in a strip of downtown that had seen better days. The brick facade was painted a cheerful pink that clashed violently with the faded grandeur of the pre-war architecture, but the bones were the same. I pushed open the door. A bell chimed. The smell of roses and baby's breath hit me like a wave. Behind the counter, a woman in her 70s looked up from arranging a bouquet. She had grey hair pinned back with tortoiseshell clips and reading glasses perched on her nose. "Help you, honey?" I hesitated. I hadn't planned what to say. "I'm looking for information about a business that used to be here," I said finally. Kowalski Portrait Studio. It closed in 1987. The woman's face changed, softened with something like nostalgia. "You're looking at a Kowalski," she said. "I'm Dorothy. My father ran that studio for 40 years. I felt my heart rate spike. Your father's records, I said, too fast, too eager. The photographs he took. Do you still have them? The negatives, I mean. Dorothy set down her pruning shears, studied me with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd seen a lot of people walk through her door with a lot of different agendas. Why do you want to know? I reached into my jacket, pulled out the photograph. Because I'm trying to find this woman, I said. And I think your father might have been the one who took this picture. Dorothy took the photograph with hands that were surprisingly steady. She tilted it toward the light, squinting at the faded image. On 62, she murmured. I would have been 16, already helping Daddy in the darkroom. She flipped the photograph over, read the inscription, examined the stamp in the corner. This is our work, she confirmed. I recognized Daddy's handwriting on the studio mark. He always did his S's with that little flourish. Do you have records from back then? Negatives? Anything that might tell me who this woman was? Dorothy looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. This is about more than genealogy, isn't it? It wasn't a question. I could have lied. Could have spun some story about a school project or a documentary or a favor for a friend. But something about this woman, her directness, her calm, made me want to tell the truth. I found this photograph in my grandfather's things, I said, along with a letter. He had an affair in 1962. The woman got pregnant. He asked her to disappear. I swallowed. I'm trying to find out what happened to her, and to the child. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she handed the photograph back. Follow me. She flipped the sign on the door to closed, and led me through a back room cluttered with ribbon spools and foam blocks, and the industrial detritus of the floral trade. A narrow staircase led to a second floor I hadn't noticed from the street. Daddy never threw anything away, she said as we climbed. Drove my mother crazy, but he always said photographs were history, and history deserved to be preserved. The upstairs was a single large room, lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets. Metal industrial, the kind you'd find in a government archive. Each drawer was labeled with a year. Dorothy walked directly to a cabinet marked 1962. We organized by month, then by date, then by client name, she said, pulling out a drawer. If the session was a walk-in, which it looks like this was since there's no client notation on the stamp, it would be filed under miscellaneous. She rifled through a stack of manila envelopes, each one containing negatives in protective sleeves. August. Here. She pulled out an envelope, opened it, held a strip of negatives up to the window. There she is, Dorothy said. Same woman, same dress, same lake in the background. Looks like they took about a dozen shots. Is there a name? I asked. Anything that identifies her? Dorothy flipped to the index card attached to the envelope. Vivian Marsh, she read. Paid cash. Address listed as 447 Cedar Street, Wilkes Barre. Vivian Marsh. I had a name, I had an address, I had a thread to pull. Dress. Wilkes Barre was 40 minutes south of Scranton, a city that had been built on anthracite coal and had never quite recovered from the industry's collapse. The downtown was a study in contrasts, historic buildings with ornate facades standing next to empty lots and shuttered storefronts. It felt like a place that was still waiting for something to save it. 547 Cedar Street was a row house in a neighborhood that had probably been working class even in its prime. The brick was painted a dull yellow. The porch sagged. An American flag hung limply from a bracket near the door. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to decide what to do. The address was 60 years old. The odds that anyone connected to Vivian Marsh still lived here were infinitesimal. But I'd driven all this way. I'd told my family I was sick. I'd lied to everyone who loved me. I wasn't going to stop now. I walked up the cracked concrete path and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to leave when a voice came from the porch next door. She ain't home, I turned. An old man was sitting in a rusted lawn chair, half hidden by a hedge that needed trimming. He had a can of Engling in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and he was watching me with the casual suspicion of someone who'd seen a lot of strangers come and go. I'm looking for someone who used to live here, I said. A woman named Vivian Marsh. This would have been in the early 1960s. The old man took a long drag on his cigarette. Vivian, he repeated. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. You knew her? Knew of her? My mother was friends with her mother. They used to play bridge together on Wednesday nights. He squinted at me through the smoke. Why are you looking for Vivian? I hesitated. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out the photograph. I think she knew my grandfather, I said. The old man leaned forward, studying the image. His expression changed, sharpened, like someone recognizing a face from a dream. That's her, all right. Pretty girl, smart too. My mother always said it was a shame what happened. What did happen? The old man settled back in his chair, took a sip of beer. She left, he said. Around Christmas of '62, if I remember right. Her mother told everyone she'd gone to live with an aunt in Ohio. But nobody ever heard from her again. Not a letter, not a phone call. Her mother died about 10 years later, and Vivian didn't even come back for the funeral. Do you know why she left? The old man gave me a look that suggested I already knew the answer. Folks had their theories, he said. This was a Catholic neighborhood. Girls didn't just disappear for no reason. She was pregnant. That was the rumor. He shrugged. Nobody talked about it openly. You didn't back then, but everybody knew. The aunt in Ohio, I pressed. Do you remember her name, or what city? The old man shook his head. My mother might have known, but she's been gone 15 years now. He paused. There might be records at Holy Rosary, though. The church. Vivian's family were parishioners there for generations. If there was anything official, baptisms, marriages, that kind of thing, it would be in their files. Holy Rosary Catholic Church. It was a lead. A fragile one, but better than nothing. I thanked the old man and walked back to my car, my mind racing. Vivian Marsh had left Wilkes-Barre in late 1962, pregnant and alone. She'd gone to Ohio, maybe, to live with an aunt whose name no one remembered. And then she'd vanished so completely that even her own mother's death couldn't bring her back. Where had she gone? What had she done? And the child, my grandfather's child, my mother's half-sibling, where were they now? I had 2 days left before the anniversary party. 2 days to find answers that had been buried for 60 years. Holy Rosary Catholic Church was a Gothic revival structure that dominated the Wilkes-Barre skyline like a stone sentinel. The spires reached toward heaven with the kind of confident ambition that only 19th century architects seemed to possess. Inside, the sanctuary was cool and dim, lit by stained glass windows that fractured the afternoon sunlight into pools of crimson and gold. The parish office was in a newer building attached to the back of the church, a utilitarian addition that clashed with the original architecture, but presumably served its purpose. A woman in her 50s sat behind the reception desk, typing something into a computer that looked like it had been state-of-the-art in 2005. Can I help you? I'm researching my family history, I said. I'm trying to find records for a woman who would have been a parishioner here in the early 1960s. Her name was Vivian Marsh. The receptionist, her nameplate said Carol, looked up from her keyboard with the wary expression of someone who'd heard this request before. Our sacramental records are confidential, she said. We can only release them to immediate family members with proper documentation. I understand. But I'm not asking for sacramental records, just anything. Parish bulletins, census records, anything that might tell me where her family went after she left town. Carol studied me for a moment. Then she sighed. Father Michael is very protective of our archives, she said. But if you want to speak with him, he might be willing to help. He's in the rectory, through that door and down the hall. Father Michael was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a literature professor than a priest. He listened to my story with the attentive stillness of someone trained to hear confessions. Vivian Marsh, he repeated when I finished, and you believe she was connected to your grandfather? Yes, Father. And you're hoping to find her or her child before your grandparents' anniversary celebration? That's right. Father Michael leaned back in his chair. What will you do if you find them? The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. I haven't gotten that far. Have you considered that some secrets are kept for a reason? That your grandfather's choice, whatever we might think of it, might have been an act of mercy as much as an act of cowardice? Mercy for whom? For everyone involved. For your grandmother, who was spared the knowledge of his infidelity. For Vivian, who was given the freedom to build a new life without the stigma of being the other woman. Sigh for the child, who grew up without the burden of knowing their father had chosen another family over them. I thought about that, but they didn't get to choose, I said finally. Vivian didn't choose to disappear. The child didn't choose to grow up without a father. My grandmother didn't choose to spend 60 years in a marriage built on a lie. My grandfather made all those choices for them. Father Mikhail nodded slowly. You're right, of course. The ethics of the situation are complicated. He stood. Wait here. He disappeared through a door at the back of the office. I heard the sound of filing cabinets opening and closing, papers shuffling. Then he returned, carrying a cardboard box. Our parish kept meticulous records in those days, he said, setting the box on his desk. The Marsh family were founding members, very active in the community. I found a few things that might be helpful. He pulled out a folder. This is a parish census from 1960. The Marsh household is listed: Eleanor Marsh, widow, age 52, Vivian Marsh, daughter, age 18, and a notation that Eleanor's sister, Margaret Dempsey, lived in Columbus, Ohio. Margaret Dempsey, the aunt. There's also this. Father Mikhail handed me a yellowed photograph. It's from the 1959 Christmas pageant. Vivian is the angel in the back row. I looked at the photo. A teenage girl with dark hair and a shy smile, wings made of cardboard and glitter, standing among a group of children dressed as shepherds and wise men. This was the woman my grandfather had loved, the woman he had abandoned. Thank you, Father. Father Mikhail nodded. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said. And I hope, when you do, that you'll have the wisdom to know what to do with it. I spent that night in a motel outside Wilkes Barre, searching every database I could access for Margaret Dempsey in Columbus, Ohio. The problem was that Margaret Dempsey was an even more common name than Vivian Marsh. There were dozens of them in Ohio alone, some still living, most dead, all of them potential dead ends. But around 2 a.m. I found something, an obituary from the Columbus Dispatch, dated September 14, 1987, Margaret A. Dempsey, 78, of Columbus, passed away peacefully on September 12th at Riverside Methodist Hospital. Born in Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania, she was a longtime member of St. Patrick's Catholic Church and a dedicated volunteer with Catholic Charities. She is survived by her niece, Vivian Marsh Harmon of Westerville, and Vivian's son, Edward Harmon. Edward Harmon. Born sometime around 1963, if my calculations were correct, my grandfather's son, my mother's half-brother, my uncle in a way that no one in my family had ever acknowledged. I pulled up a White Pages search, typed in Edward Harmon, Westerville, Ohio. One result. I had an address, I had a phone number, and I had a decision to make. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay on the motel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, running through scenarios in my mind like a chess player, calculating moves and counter-moves. Option 1. I could call Edward Harmon, introduce myself, explain what I'd found, hope that he already knew about his biological father, or hope that if he didn't, the revelation wouldn't destroy him. Option 2. I could go to the anniversary party, say nothing, and let the secret die with my grandfather. Vivian and Edward had built lives without us. They'd survived 6 decades without knowing the Calloway family existed. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was leave them alone. Option 3. I could confront my grandfather directly. Show him the letter, demand an explanation, give him the chance to make things right before I made any decisions about contact. Each option had consequences I couldn't fully predict. Option 1 might heal a wound that had been festering for 60 years, or it might tear open a scar that had already closed. Option 2 would protect my family's comfortable illusions, but it would make me complicit in the same deception that had shaped all our lives. Option 3 would give my grandfather agency, but it would also give him the chance to bury the truth even deeper. By the time the sun came up, I'd made my decision. I was going home. I was going to the anniversary party, and I was going to make my grandfather face what he'd done. I pulled into Johnstown around noon on Saturday, the day before the party. The town looked the same as it always did, faded, resilient, clinging to an identity that the modern economy had rendered obsolete. The smokestacks of the old mill stood like tombstones against the grey October sky, monuments to an industry that had abandoned this place long before I was born. My mother's car was in my grandparents' driveway when I arrived. So was Aunt Cecilia's. So was my cousin David's. The whole family gathered for the final preparations. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, the letter burning against my chest like a live coal. Then I walked inside. The house smelled like pot roast and my grandmother's perfume. A combination so specific to my childhood that it hit me like a physical blow. Lorraine was in the kitchen, directing traffic like a general commanding troops. My mother was arranging flowers on the dining room table. Aunt Cecilia was ironing tablecloths. David was testing the slideshow on the old television set, and my grandfather was sitting in his recliner, watching everything with the bemused satisfaction of a man who knew he was loved. "Nathan," my grandmother spotted me first. "Where have you been? Your mother said you were sick, but you don't look sick to me." "I had some things to take care of," I said, hugging her. "I'm fine now." "Well, you're here, and that's what matters. Go say hello to your grandfather. He's been asking about you." I crossed the living room to where Walter sat. He looked frailer than I remembered, the inevitable erosion of 91 years, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, blue-gray like lake water in winter. "Nathan." He extended a hand and I shook it. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but there was still a stubbornness in the way he held on. "Good to see you, son." "You too, Grandpa. Pull up a chair. Tell me what's new." I sat, looked at this man I'd loved my entire life, this man who had taught me to fish and to fix a flat tire and to never make promises I couldn't keep, this man who had fathered a child with another woman and asked her to disappear. "Actually," I said quietly, "I was hoping we could talk. In private." Walter studied my face. Something flickered in those sharp eyes, a recognition maybe of the weight I was carrying. "Walk with me," he said. "I could use some fresh air." He levered himself out of the chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had become an adversary. I offered my arm. He waved it away. "I'm not dead yet," he said. We walked out the back door into the small yard where I'd played as a child. The vegetable garden was dormant now, covered in brown mulch for the winter. The old oak tree still stood in the corner, its leaves gone, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Walter lowered himself onto the wooden bench my grandmother had positioned to catch the afternoon sun. I sat beside him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out the letter. "I found this in the attic," I said, "in one of the hymnals. There was a photograph too." Walter didn't move, didn't look at the paper in my hand. "I know what that is," he said quietly. "Then you know what I'm going to ask?" He closed his eyes. The lines on his face seemed to deepen, as if 60 years of buried guilt were rising to the surface all at once. "I always wondered if someone would find it," he said. "I should have destroyed it, but I couldn't. Every time I tried, I'd think about Vivian, about how the letter was the only proof that what we had was real, that it wasn't just a dream I'd made up to torture myself. Tell me about her." Walter opened his eyes, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Vulnerable, raw, stripped of the stoic dignity he'd worn like armor for as long as I'd known him. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." He was quiet for a long time. Then he began to speak. "I met her in the summer of 1962, Walter said. 3 months before I married your grandmother." He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone retrieving artifacts from a deep well. "The mill sent a group of us to a training conference in Scranton, some new safety protocols they wanted the supervisors to learn. I was the youngest man in the group, 22 years old, and terrified I'd say something stupid in front of all those older guys. The hotel where we stayed had a bar on the ground floor. Nothing fancy, just a place for working men to drink beer and pretend their lives were simpler than they were. I went down there the first night, hoping to take the edge off my nerves. Vivian was the bartender. She was beautiful, but that wasn't what struck me. What struck me was how she looked at me, like she could see right through all my defenses to the scared kid underneath, like she understood something about me that I hadn't figured out myself. We talked that night, just talked, about nothing important. But when I went back to my room, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she laughed, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way her dark hair fell across her forehead. I went back to that bar every night for the rest of the conference. By the third night, I knew I was in trouble. By the fifth night, I was in love. Walter paused, drew a breath that seemed to hurt him. I should have stopped. I was engaged to Lorraine. The wedding was 3 months away. Our families had already put down deposits on the church, the reception hall, everything. But I couldn't stay away from Vivian. It was like she had gravity, and I was just falling. Did she know about Grandma? Walter nodded slowly. I told her on the second night. Figured she'd slap my face and tell me to leave her alone. But she didn't. She just looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "That's your problem, not mine." I should have been offended. Should have realized she was giving me an out. But instead, I took it as permission. Permission to keep seeing her. Permission to let myself feel things I had no right to feel. "And the lake?" I asked. "Wallenpaupack." Her idea. She had a weekend off in August. Said she knew a place where we could get away from everything. A little cabin her aunt owned on the lake. "Just the two of us," she said. "No Johnstown, no Scranton, no wedding invitations, just us." I told Lorraine I'd picked up an extra shift. Drove 3 hours to meet Vivian at a diner in Wilkes Bar. We spent 3 days at that cabin. Swimming, fishing, lying on the dock at night and counting stars. I've never been happier than I was during those 3 days, and I've never hated myself more. Walter's voice cracked on the last words. When I got back to Johnstown, Lorraine was waiting for me. She'd baked a pie, apple, my favorite. She was so excited to see me, so full of plans for the wedding, so completely unaware that I'd just spent a weekend with another woman. I looked at her, this kind, trusting girl who'd done nothing wrong, and I made a decision. I was going to end things with Vivian. I was going to be the man Lorraine deserved. I was going to build a life here in this town with this woman, and I was never going to think about Wallenpaupack again. But then Vivian got pregnant. Walter closed his eyes. She told me in October, 2 weeks before the wedding. Said she wasn't asking me to leave Lorraine, said she wasn't trying to trap me. She just thought I deserved to know. I panicked. I'm not proud of it, but that's the truth. I panicked. All I could think about was what would happen if anyone found out. My reputation, my job, Lorraine's reputation, her family, our families, the whole carefully constructed life I'd been building, gone, just like that. So I did the cowardly thing. I sent her money, asked her to disappear, wrote that letter you're holding and left it in an envelope at the bar, along with every dollar I'd saved. I never heard from her again. He fell silent. The wind stirred the bare branches of the oak tree. From inside the house I could hear my grandmother laughing at something. "Did you ever try to find her?" I asked. Walter shook his head. I was too scared, too guilty, and after a while, the guilt faded into something else, something I could live with. I told myself she was better off without me, that the child was better off without a father who was too much of a coward to claim them, that the kindest thing I could do was stay away. He looked at me and there were tears in his eyes. "Do you know the worst part, Nathan? I never stopped loving her. 60 years of marriage to your grandmother, a good marriage mostly, and I never stopped thinking about Vivian, about the life I could have had, about the child I never held. Every time I looked at your mother as a baby, I wondered if Vivian's child had the same eyes. Every time I taught you how to fish, I wondered if there was another boy somewhere who would never learn those things from me. I loved your grandmother. I did. I've tried to be a good husband to her, but there's always been a part of me, the part that stayed at Wallenpaupack that belonged to Vivian." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "So there it is. The truth about your grandfather. Not the man you thought you knew. Just a coward who abandoned the woman he loved and spent 60 years pretending it never happened." We sat in silence for a long time. I tried to reconcile this confession with everything I'd believed about Walter Calloway. The stoic, the provider, the rock upon which 3 generations had built their understanding of what a man should be. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the contradiction wasn't as stark as it seemed. My grandfather was a man who did his duty, who showed up every day even when he didn't want to, who built a life through sheer willpower, 1 brick at a time. That was true, but it was also true that duty and love weren't always the same thing, that showing up wasn't the same as being present, that building a life didn't mean you couldn't grieve for the life you'd left behind. Walter Calloway had done what men of his generation were supposed to do. He'd honored his commitment. He'd provided for his family. He'd never complained. But he'd also carried a wound that had never healed, a love that had never died, a guilt that had shaped every relationship he'd ever had, whether he admitted it or not. "Grandpa," I said finally, "I found her." Walter's head snapped toward me. "What?" "Vivian. I found records. She went to Ohio to live with her aunt. She got married, a man named Harmon. They had a son. His name is Edward. He's 61 now, lives in Westerville, Ohio." Walter stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. "You found my son?" "Your son," I confirmed. "He's alive. At least he was when the white pages were last updated. I have his address, his phone number." For a moment I thought my grandfather was going to have a heart attack. His face went pale. His hands gripped the edge of the bench so tightly I could see his knuckles whiten. 61 years, he whispered. "He's lived 61 years without me." "That's not the question, Grandpa." He looked at me. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" The anniversary party was scheduled for Sunday at 3 p.m. 247 guests, the American Legion Hall. A caterer, a DJ, the works. My grandfather had 36 hours to decide whether to spend the rest of his life maintaining a lie or tear down everything he'd built. I expected him to choose the lie. I was wrong. Sunday morning, Walter Calloway called a family meeting. It was uncharacteristic enough that everyone gathered in the living room with expressions ranging from confused to concerned. My grandmother sat in her favorite chair, my mother and aunt flanking her like protective sentries. David and I stood against the wall. The cousins who'd arrived early for setup milled around the edges, uncertain whether to stay or go. Walter stood in the center of the room, leaning on the cane he'd resisted using for years. "Before we go to this party," he said, "there's something you all need to know." And then he told them everything. "I've seen a lot of things in my life. Car accidents, house fires, my father walking out the door with a suitcase in his hand. But I've never seen anything like the moment my grandfather confessed to 60 years of deception." My grandmother's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, rage, grief. She didn't say a word, just sat in her chair gripping the armrests, while her husband of 6 decades told her he'd loved another woman, fathered another child, and lied to her every single day of their marriage. My mother cried. Silent tears that streamed down her face as she absorbed the knowledge that she had a half-brother she'd never met, that her father, her hero, her touchstone, had been someone else entirely. Aunt Cecilia demanded explanations. Where was this woman now? Was she still alive? Had Walter been in contact with her all this time? Each answer, "I don't know, I don't know, no," seemed to make her angrier. David just looked shell-shocked. The slideshow he'd spent weeks editing, 60 years of loving photographs set to romantic music, suddenly seemed like a monument to a fantasy. And through it all, Walter stood in the center of the room, accepting every accusation, every sob, every furious question, without flinching. "I'm not telling you this to ask for forgiveness," he said, when the initial storm had passed. "I know I don't deserve it. I'm telling you because Nathan found the truth and you deserve to know it too. And because," he faltered, "because I don't want to die with this lie in my chest. I'm 91 years old. I've lived with this secret for 60 years. I'm tired of carrying it." "What do you want us to do?" my mother asked, her voice raw. "Cancel the party? Pretend nothing happened?" Walter shook his head. "I want to call Edward," he said. "Nathan found his number. I want to call my son, my other son, and tell him I'm sorry. I want to tell him I'm sorry I wasn't there. I want to tell him I thought about him every day. And I want to invite him to the party." The room erupted again. "Grandmother, you want to bring that woman's child to our anniversary party? To rub my face in your betrayal in front of everyone we know? Mother, Dad, that's insane. You can't just introduce a secret son to the whole family without any warning." "Aunt Cecilia, what about Mum? What about what this will do to her?" But my grandmother, who had just learned that her entire marriage was a facade, raised a hand. The room fell silent. "Let him make the call," she said. Everyone stared at her. "Lorraine," my mother started. I said, "Let him." Grandmother's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I've been married to this man for 60 years. I've shared a bed with him, raised children with him, built a life with him, and I never knew. I never knew." She looked at Walter with an expression I couldn't read. If there's a child out there, a man now, who grew up without a father because of choices we made, then he deserves to hear from us, from his father, even if it's 60 years too late. "Lorraine, are you sure?" "I'm sure I've spent 6 decades living with a stranger," she said. "I'm sure I've built my entire identity around a marriage that was never what I thought it was. I'm sure I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow or next week or next year." She stood. "But I'm also sure that secrets have poisoned this family for long enough. So make the call, Walter. Let's see what happens." Walter's hands were shaking as he dialed the number. We all watched in silence. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. "Hello? Is this Edward Harmon?" "Yes, who's calling?" Walter closed his eyes. "My name is Walter Calloway. I don't know how to say this. I knew your mother a long time ago. In Pennsylvania, before you were born." A long pause. "You're him," Edward said. "Aren't you? You're the man in the letter. You know about the letter. My mother kept it, along with the photograph. She showed them to me when I was 18, told me everything, said she didn't want me finding out after she was gone." Walter's knees buckled. David lunged forward to catch him, lowering him into a chair. "She told you," Walter whispered. "She told you about me. She told me you chose your duty over your love. She told me she understood. She told me never to blame you." And did you? "Blame me?" Another pause. "Longer this time." "I spent most of my life trying not to," Edward said. "Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I didn't. When I was a kid, I used to wonder what you were like, whether I looked like you, whether you ever thought about me. When I got older, I tried to stop caring, told myself you weren't worth the energy." "I thought about you every day," Walter said. "Every single day." "Yeah. Well, that doesn't really change anything, does it?" "No, it doesn't. But I want you to know it anyway." Silence stretched across the phone line, across the miles, across 60 years of absence. "Why are you calling now?" Edward asked finally. "After all this time?" "Because my grandson found your mother's letter, found the photograph, found you, and I realized I didn't want to die without you knowing I was sorry." "Dying?" "I'm 91 years old, Edward. I don't have much time left. A year, maybe less. And I've spent 60 years being a coward. I don't want to be a coward anymore." I could hear Edward breathing on the other end of the line, heavy, deliberate. "My mother died 3 years ago," he said. "Did you know that?" Walter's face crumpled. "No, I didn't know. She was 81, lung cancer. Never smoked a day in her life, but the cancer didn't care." Edward's voice hardened. "She talked about you at the end. When the morphine made her confused, she'd say your name, ask where you were, ask why you hadn't come. Edward, I couldn't tell her you weren't coming. She was dying, and I couldn't tell her the man she'd never stopped loving wasn't going to show up. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you keep saying that, more silence. You keep... Then, what do you want from me, Walter? Absolution? Forgiveness? A deathbed reconciliation that makes you feel better about everything?" "I don't want anything from you," Walter said. "I know I don't have the right to want anything. I wanted you to know you existed in my heart, even when I couldn't be there, even when I was too much of a coward to find you. You were always there." "That's not nothing," Edward admitted. "But it's not enough either." "I know. So where does that leave us?" Walter looked around the room at his family, the family he'd built on a foundation of lies, the family that was still standing despite everything. "There's going to be a party today," he said. "An anniversary party. 200 people celebrating 60 years of a marriage that was more complicated than any of them knew." He took a breath. "I'd like you to come, if you're willing, not for me, for them, for my daughters." your half-sisters, for my grandchildren, for everyone who deserves to know you exist. You want me to crash your anniversary party? I want you to be acknowledged, publicly, as my son, as part of this family, as the person you should have been all along. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then Edward laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd just been handed the strangest gift of his life and didn't know whether to accept it or throw it away. "You know what?" he said. "I think I will. I've been wondering about you people my whole life. Might as well meet you before the old man kicks the bucket." "Thank you," Walter whispered. "Don't thank me yet. I'm not promising to be nice. I wouldn't expect you to be. I'll be there in 4 hours. Text me the address." He hung up. Walter slumped in his chair, tears streaming down his face. "He's coming," he said to no one in particular. "My son is coming." The next 4 hours were a blur. Frantic phone calls were made to the caterer, explaining that we needed one more place setting at the family table. David scrambled to add a slide to his presentation, a blank one with just Edward's name, while my mother and aunt argued about what to say to the guests. My grandmother retreated to her bedroom and didn't emerge until it was time to leave, and Walter sat in his recliner staring at the wall, looking like a man who'd just been emptied out and refilled with something new. At 2:30, we caravanned to the American Legion Hall. At 2:45, the guests started arriving. At 3:15, a silver Honda Accord with Ohio plates pulled into the parking lot. Edward Harmon stepped out. He was tall, taller than my grandfather had ever been, with dark hair gone grey at the temples and a build that suggested he'd worked with his hands at some point in his life. His eyes, when they swept across the gathering crowd outside the hall, were the same blue-grey as Walter's. He looked like my grandfather. He looked like my mother. He looked like someone who should have been standing in our family photographs for 60 years. I walked out to meet him. "Edward?" He turned, studied me. "You must be Nathan, the one who found the letter." "That's me." "You stirred up a hell of a hornet's nest, kid." "I know." He looked past me toward the hall, toward the crowd of Callaways and Whitfields and assorted family friends who had no idea their world was about to change. "Is he in there?" "Yes." "And your grandmother?" "She's handling it, in her own way." Edward nodded slowly. "Let's get this over with then." The moment Edward Harmon walked into the American Legion Hall, the anniversary party transformed into something else entirely. I watched as 200 faces turned toward the doorway, as whispers rippled through the crowd, as my grandfather rose from his seat at the head table, slowly, painfully, leaning on his cane, and faced the son he'd never known. They stood there, 20 feet apart, surrounded by streamers and balloons and a banner that read, "60 years of love." Neither of them spoke. Then Walter took a step forward, and another, and another. Edward didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his expression unreadable, as his 91-year-old father shuffled toward him. When Walter finally reached him, he stopped. "You look like her," he said. "Like Vivian." "I know. She was the most beautiful woman I ever knew." "She talked about you sometimes," Edward said. "When she thought I wasn't listening, she'd say your name like a prayer, like something she still believed in, even after everything." Walter's face crumpled. "I didn't deserve her," he whispered. "I didn't deserve any of it." "No," Edward agreed, "you didn't." They stood in silence, surrounded by a crowd that had gone so quiet you could hear the balloons shifting in the draft from the air conditioning. Then Edward extended his hand. "I'm Edward Harmon," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm Walter Calloway's son. He left my mother when she was pregnant with me, and I grew up without ever knowing who he was. But I'm here now, and I'd like to meet the rest of my family." The murmur that followed was like a wave breaking. Shock, confusion, questions passing from person to person as the revelation spread through the room. But before anyone could react, my grandmother stood up. She walked to where Walter and Edward stood, looked at her husband, looked at this stranger who shared his eyes. Then she reached out and took Edward's hand. "I'm Lorraine," she said. "I've been married to your father for 60 years. I didn't know about you until yesterday, and I have no idea what I'm supposed to feel right now." Edward's composure flickered. "I don't expect you to feel anything, ma'am. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just came because I needed to see him. Just once, before it was too late." My grandmother nodded. "Then you'll sit with us," she said, "at the family table. Whatever else happens, you're family. You were always family. We just didn't know it." And she led him, this stranger, this secret, this son who should have been hers too, to the empty chair that had been set for him. The party continued. It wasn't the party anyone had planned. The speeches were awkward, interrupted by glances toward the newcomer at the family table. The slideshow played out to a room full of people who were suddenly seeing 60 years of photographs through entirely different eyes. But something unexpected happened too. People started talking. One by one, guests approached Edward, asked him questions, introduced themselves, treated him not as an intruder, but as a relative they'd somehow misplaced and finally found. My mother and aunt sat on either side of him for hours, comparing childhoods, filling in gaps, piecing together two parallel lives that had never intersected until now. David pulled up old family photos on his phone, pointing out resemblances Edward had never seen. And Walter, my grandfather, the stoic, the keeper of secrets, wept openly as he watched his family knit itself back together around the wound he'd created. It wasn't a happy ending. Not exactly. There was too much pain for that. Too many years lost. Too many questions that couldn't be answered. But it was a beginning. The anniversary party ended around 10 p.m. The guests filtered out slowly, many of them stopping by our table to offer words that ranged from awkward to supportive to genuinely kind. A few of the older relatives, people who'd known my grandparents since before my mother was born, seemed stunned, as if the foundation of their understanding had cracked. Others seemed almost relieved, like people who'd always sensed something hidden and were glad to finally know what it was. Edward stayed until the end. When the last of the decorations had been cleared and the Legion Hall fell silent, he found me by the coat rack, pulling on my jacket. "This isn't what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Hostility, maybe, or denial, or some elaborate performance to make me feel like the problem. He shook his head. "I didn't expect your grandmother to hold my hand. I didn't expect your mother to cry and tell me she wished she'd grown up with a brother. I didn't expect," and he trailed off. "Didn't expect what?" "I didn't expect them to be good people," he said quietly. "I spent 60 years imagining the family that chose itself over me. In my head they were, I don't know, villains, I guess. Selfish and cold and not worth missing." He looked toward the door where my grandfather was being helped into my aunt's car. "He's not what I imagined either. I thought he'd be defensive, arrogant, the kind of man who justifies everything he does. But he just apologized, over and over, like he'd been waiting 60 years for someone to finally let him say it. Maybe he was." Edward nodded. "Maybe." He extended his hand, and I shook it. "I don't know what happens next," he said. "I don't know if I want to be part of this family, or if I'm too old and too set in my ways to start over. But I'm glad I came. I'm glad I got to see him, to see all of you." "You're welcome any time," I said. "I mean that." He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him all night. "Take care of him, Nathan. He doesn't have much time left. And despite everything, I think he's earned the right to die in peace." He walked out into the October night. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner, carrying 60 years of silence back to Ohio. The months that followed were complicated. My grandmother didn't forgive my grandfather, not right away, maybe not ever. But she also didn't leave him. She moved into the guest bedroom, took her meals at a different time, treated him with a cool politeness that was somehow worse than anger. "I'm too old to start over," she told me once, "and he's too old to change, so we'll muddle through the way old people do." My mother and Aunt Cecilia drove to Ohio twice to visit Edward. They took him to the lake where Vivian was buried, a small cemetery on the outskirts of Columbus where she'd spent the last decades of her life. They brought flowers and photographs and stories about the father she'd loved. Edward didn't come back to Johnstown, not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas, not for any of the occasions that might have brought us together, but he called. Weekly at first, then more often. Long conversations with my grandfather about nothing and everything. Sports, the weather, the aches and pains of aging. Small talk, filling in the silence of 60 years. Walter Calloway died the following April. He went quietly in his sleep, in the house on Oak Street where he'd lived for most of his life. My grandmother found him in the morning, still in his recliner, a book open on his chest. The funeral was small, family only. No American Legion Hall, no caterer, no slideshows. Edward came. He stood at the graveside, this stranger who'd become something like a brother to my mother, and he watched as the man who'd abandoned him was lowered into the Pennsylvania earth. Afterward, he found me by the catering tent. "I'm glad I got to know him," he said. "Even for a few months, even after everything, I'm glad." "He was glad too," I said. "He told me, near the end, said meeting you was the best thing that had happened to him in 60 years. Edward's eyes glistened. "The letters stopped coming, you know. When I was a kid, my mother would send one every year, to a P.O. box she'd set up in Scranton, just in case he wanted to respond. She never heard back, but she kept writing until I was 18. He never knew about the P.O. box. I figured as much. Too proud to check or too scared." Edward shook his head. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that he finally reached out, that he didn't let the fear win in the end." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Take care of your grandmother, Nathan. She's stronger than she looks. She's going to be fine." And she was. Lorraine Calloway outlived her husband by 6 years. She eventually moved out of the house on Oak Street and into a retirement community closer to my mother. She never remarried, never really talked about Walter much except on the rare occasions when someone asked. "He was complicated," she'd say. "Aren't we all?" She died at 93, in her sleep, just like he had. Edward came to that funeral too. By then, he'd become something like an uncle to David and me. A presence at holidays, if not a constant one. A voice on the phone, a name in our address books. The secret that had fractured our family had also, in its strange way, expanded it. I still have the letter. I keep it in a lockbox in my closet, along with the photograph of Vivian by the lake. Sometimes late at night, I take them out and look at them. Try to imagine what my grandfather felt when he wrote those words. Try to imagine what Vivian felt when she read them. I don't know if he made the right choice. I don't think anyone does when they're young and scared and facing a decision that will shape the rest of their lives. What I know is that secrets have weight. They accumulate, year after year, until the burden becomes unbearable. And when they finally come out, as they always do sooner or later, they transform everything they touch. My grandfather's perfect marriage was never perfect. It was built on a foundation of silence and sacrifice, and a love that couldn't quite survive its own contradictions. But it was also real. 60 years of shared meals and sleepless nights, and small kindnesses and petty arguments, and everything else that makes a life together. Both things were true, the fairy tale and the tragedy, the love and the betrayal, and in the end, maybe that's the lesson. That people are complicated, that marriages are complicated, that the stories we tell about our families are always simpler than the truth, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is finally tell the truth, even when it's 60 years too late. And drop a comment below. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew? I'd love to hear your stories. Until next time. This is Silver Fox, reminding you that the truth always finds a way